Chapter by chapter. Summary part. 1 Chapter 1 Coronado Island, California, May 1966. In May 1966, 20-year-old Frankie Grace MCGR is elegantly dressed for a lavish Bond voyage celebration at the prestigious MCRA family estate. This estate is located on Coronado Beach, nestled between the renowned Hotel Coronado and the Naval Air Station North Island near San Diego. Her older brother, Finlay MCGR, is about to depart for the Vietnam War after graduating from the Naval Academy. Finlay's best friend, Joseph Riaso R.Y. Walsh, is joyfully celebrating with him. The men in their family have a long history of military service, with Grandpa Francis MCGR having received a medal and grandfather Alexander a Purple Heart. The only exception is her father Connor MCRA, who was disqualified from service, much to his shame. Francis' mother Bet MCGR comes from old money, and Connor, once employed by Bet's late father, has since tripled the family's wealth through real estate development in California. He began his success by building affordable housing for returning veterans, which he considers his contribution to the war effort. Frankie is in her father's office, gazing at a wall of family photos and memorabilia when R.Y. Walsh enters. When asked about the absence of women on the wall, Francis explains that it is a hero's wall honoring their families' military achievements. R.Y. counters that women can be heroes, leaving Francis momentarily puzzled. Later, after the party ends, Francis reflects on Rye's comment and contemplates her own future and potential. She had always assumed she would marry and become a mother. When she talks to Finnell, she expresses her worries about his safety in the war. He reassures her, trying to conceal his own fears. Chapter 2 Over the following 6 months, Frankie takes additional courses to qualify as a registered nurse and begins working the night shift at a nearby hospital in San Diego. One night during her rounds, Frankie tends to a patient who recently returned from Vietnam after losing his legs. He recounts how a nurse in Vietnam helped him cope with the initial shock. Inspired by the thought of becoming a hero and her family's strong tradition of military service, Frankie decides that night to enlist as a nurse in Vietnam to contribute to the war effort. She first visits the Navy recruitment station, only to be told she needs 2 years of experience before she can enlist. The Air Force recruiters give her the same response. Finally, Frankie approaches the Army recruiters, who quickly enlist her in the Army Nurse Corps as Second Lieutenant Francis MCGR. Chapter 3 When Frankie returns home, she announces to her parents that she will begin basic training in 3 weeks. To her surprise, they are not pleased with the news. Her father objects, insisting that only the men in their family are meant to serve and that they are a Navy family. Their conversation is abruptly interrupted by the doorbell. They find 2 naval officers at their doorstep who deliver the devastating news that Finlay has been killed in action, shot down in a helicopter. Frankie's mother, overcome with grief, pleads with her not to go to Vietnam. However, Frankie remains resolute in her decision. She assures her mother that she will return home from the war, but her mother, heartbroken, reminds her that those were Finlay's last words to her as well. Chapter 4 By March, Frankie has successfully completed and excelled at basic training. On her flight to Vietnam, she is seated next to Captain Noor Bronson. As they descend into Sion, the plane comes under fire, and Frankie hears a bomb explode in the distance. She is taken by bus to a jeep, which then transports her to her temporary living quarters. After taking a sip of water, Frankie is warned not to drink it and wakes up in the middle of the night with stomach pains. The following morning, Frankie reports to the colonel and is assigned to the 36th Evac Hospital, a 400-bed facility located about 60 mi from Sion. She travels there by helicopter, which comes under a hail of bullets. During the journey, Frankie is one of 9 female nurses at the hospital, along with some male nurses and army medics. The medical staff also includes several doctors and 4 surgeons. Upon arrival, she is welcomed by First Lieutenant Patty Perkins, a surgical nurse who gives her an overview of the situation. Patty also provides her with pills for malaria and diarrhea before quickly leaving Frankie in a small room with 3 plain cots where will be staying. Chapter 5. A few hours later, 2 women enter the room and introduce themselves. Ethel Flint, a 25-year-old red-headed ER nurse from Virginia, and Barbara Suber Johnson, also 25, a black surgical nurse. They inform Frankie that her clothes are unsuitable for the conditions there and offer her an oversized t-shirt and jean shorts instead. The women take Frankie to meet the other staff members. As they make their introductions, bombs explode in the distance. Jimmy Callahan, a surgeon, notices Frankie flinching at the sounds and reassures her, offering a shot of whiskey to help calm her nerves. Chapter 6. Frankie wakes up feeling ill after having 2 shots of whiskey the previous night. She heads to the mess hall for some food but ends up vomiting. Immediately afterward, she checks in with Major Wendy Goldstein at 8:03 a.m. and is reprimanded for being 3 minutes late. She is told she will be reporting to Lieutenant Flint in the ER for the day and will receive her assignment tomorrow. In the ER, they are dealing with a mass casualty event referred to as a MASCAL. Unarmed medevac helicopters known as dust-offs bring in injured soldiers from the field. Medics rush in and out amidst a haze of screams, smoke, and shouting. Ethel quickly instructs Frankie to hold the hand of a dying soldier. Private Foret, before he passes away, Foret asks about his friend Private Steo Grand. Frankie lies, saying that Steo is asking about him too. In the evening, Ethel finds Frankie crying by the sea and advises her not to go out alone for her own safety, as not all soldiers are gentlemen. They chat and Ethel explains that she enlisted after the man she loved, George, shipped out and died before that. She had planned to become a veterinarian like her father. They grab a bite at the mess hall and Ethel encourages Frankie to join her at the officers' club, the R Club, for some music and dancing. In the middle of the night, Frankie wakes up needing to use the restroom despite Ethel's advice not to go out alone. Frankie heads towards the latrines and encounters Jamie, who is smoking outside. He is upset and seeks company, revealing that a high school football friend was among the injured soldiers that day and begged him to save his life. Frankie tries to comfort him and shares about Finlay. Jamie then walks her back to her quarters. Chapter 7. In the morning, Major Goldstein assigns Frankie to the neurology ward for the night shift. The Neuro W is relatively calm and quiet, located in a dude hut equipped with specialized striker beds. Surrounded by medical equipment like ventilators and monitors, Frankie reports to the attending physician, Captain Ted Smith. Captain Smith introduces her to one of the patients, a Vietnamese man, and explains that they also treat villagers brought in for care. All the patients in this ward have brain injuries and are only there temporarily as an evac hospital. Their primary role is to monitor, stabilize, and keep patients alive until they can be transferred to Third Field Hospital in the neuro ward. Frankie begins to refine her nursing skills, learning to change dressings and care for the patients despite their states. She speaks to and comforts them. 6 weeks into her neuro assignment, she checks on Private George Ruiz, a radio operator who saved most of his platoon. 2 of the men he saved come to visit him and thank her for taking care of him. Later that night, Ethel and Bob invite Frankie to participate in MedCap, the medical civic action program organized by Captain Smith to provide medical care to the locals. They drive cautiously, aware that the wet song could be hidden nearby. Upon reaching a local village, they set up stations to provide medical care, spending the next few hours distributing medicines and performing checkups, communicating with the locals through hand signals. Frankie is eventually interrupted by a young boy tugging at her arm. He leads her to a room where she finds a young girl with gangrene. Frankie calls for Captain Smith and assists him in amputating the girl's leg. After the procedure, the boy offers her a smooth stone which she interprets as a gift. In return, Frankie gives the boy her confirmation necklace. Later, as she reflects on the stone, she thinks about the work she did that day in saving the girl's life. Chapter 8. In May, Frankie receives a letter from her mother describing the anti-war protests happening back home. Meanwhile, Frankie has been promoted to the day shift in the neuro ward tonight. She plans to attend Captain Smith's going away party. Captain Smith has been an exceptional teacher and kind mentor to her. The party is being held at the Officers Club in Long Bin. A helicopter ride away. During the flight, Frankie catches glimpses of both the beauty of Vietnam and the devastation caused by the war. Upon arriving, Jimmy Callahan invites Frankie to dance. Jamie mentions that Barb and Ethel have been advocating for her to take on more challenging work, suggesting she join him in surgery. He reassures her that he's simply looking for a kick-ass nurse. Frankie agrees to submit a transfer request but suspects Jam has a history of seducing women and worries she might be next on his list. Frankie's first day in the O operating room is intense. Her initial patient has a frag wound, requiring the removal of metal shards and dead skin. After 6 hours and numerous patients, Jimmy and Frankie finish stitching up a patient with a gunshot wound to the chest. Later, Barb encourages Frankie to join them at the O Club. There, Ethel congratulates her on her first day in surgery, but also warns her that Jamie is married and advises caution to avoid gaining a reputation. Frankie confronts Jamie about it, and he dismisses it nonchalant. When Frankie asks about his wife of 4 years, Sarah, and son Dave, Jamie explains that Sarah got pregnant the first time they had sex, leading them to get married. Frankie writes to her mother about her desire to excel as a surgical nurse and her passion for the work. Her mother responds with concerns for her safety but also acknowledges that it must be fulfilling to be good at something so meaningful. Chapter In June, as Patty's tour of service is nearing its end, she is determined to pass on all her knowledge to Frankie. During a surgery, another urgent case arises and Jamie instructs Frankie to finish stitching the patient on her own. By late June, monsoon season is in full swing. Frankie and Gia have been working side by side for countless hours each day, developing a deep care for each other. One night, Jamie confides that he wishes he had met her first. Meanwhile, Frankie's mother writes about the increasingly violent and fervent war protests back home. In late July, Bob organizes a medcap trip to a local orphanage. During the visit, someone asks Frankie to help a young girl with burns and a fever who was found in her diseased mother's arms. Afterward, Frankie is deeply upset and Jamie offers comforting words. Frankie later reflects on how the bombing of villages full of women and children had not been reported in the Stars and Stripes newspaper. Chapter 10th. August passes and soon it's September. Frankie, operating on just 2 hours of sleep, is awakened by Ethel and Bob to join them on a naval Seawolf helicopter for Ethel's farewell beach party along a riverbank near Cian. Pilot Slim and his co-pilot Coyote, Lieutenant Melvin Turner, fly them there. At the party, Coyote offers Frankie a chance to water ski. Despite her initial trepidation, Frankie gives it a try and eventually manages to water ski after 4 attempts. Later that night, Ethel invites Bob and Frankie to visit her in Virginia. Frankie, feeling tipsy, is asked to dance by Jamie, whose own Vietnam tour will conclude in 3 months. During the dance, he kisses her neck, but Frankie hesitantly asks him to stop. The party is cut short when the Navy personnel are called to action in Plu. The following day, Ethel has departed and Jamie leaves for a week-long R&R trip to Maui to visit his wife Sarah. Before he departs, Jamie confesses his love to Frankie in the operating room. Frankie assists Dr. Rob Allen during Ja's absence when a helicopter arrives. Frankie rushes to greet the patient only to discover it's Jamie. He has lost his left leg, sustained a serious head injury, and has a gaping chest wound. Frankie learns that his helicopter was shot down as he was leaving Vietnam. Chapter 11. Following Dr. Rob's frantic attempts to save him, Jam is transferred to Neuro. Barely clinging to life, Frankie tries to comfort Jamie, urging him to hold on. A helicopter arrives to airlift Jam to a hospital. Before he is taken away, Frankie takes the stone given to her by the Vietnamese boy, writes "You fight" on one side and MCGR on the other, and places it in Jamie's duffel bag. She whispers that she loves him as they prepare to move Jamie to the helicopter. His heart fails, and he passes away. The atmosphere at the O Club is subdued following Jamie's death. Barb informs Frankie that her tour of duty will conclude in December. Frankie writes to Ethel sharing the news of Jamie's passing. Frankie is then summoned to report to Major Goldstein, who informs her of her transfer to 71st Evac in Plu, located near the Cambodian border in dense jungle. The area is experiencing heavy combat when Frankie informs Bob about her new assignment. Bob offers to transfer with her soon after. A new nurse named Wilma Cottington arrives to take the empty cot in their room in Plu. The Medivac Hospital is a collection of huts and temporary buildings. They are airlifted in and greeted by Sergeant Alvarez. After a brief orientation, they are assigned to a hut with 2 cots for their accommodation. Medevac helicopters soon arrive, and the women are directed to report to Lieutenant Colonel Harry Hap Dickerson in the O. Frankie assists Hap while Barb is assigned to assist Captain Winstead. Meanwhile, a nearby motor attack causes the electricity to fail, prompting the emergency generators to kick in, fearing their camp is targeted. They work in darkness with only flashlights. Over the next 10 hours they operate under these conditions as waves of injured soldiers are brought in. Chapter 12. By this time the army had expedited basic training to deploy new recruits to Vietnam faster, contributing to the presence of approximately 450,000 American men serving there at 71st Evac. During busy periods, nurses and doctors often worked grueling 18-hour shifts, sometimes in blackout conditions or while facing direct rocket attacks in an area of the camp known as the Park. There's a makeshift tiki bar where Barb and Frankie often find rest. They glance at newspaper headlines proclaiming us victories in the war, but Frankie recalls similar headlines from when Finlay died in mid-November. A sudden heat wave contrasts sharply with the previous constant rains near the morgue. Frankie notices a young black Hans body on a litter next to a stack of body bags in his helmet. There's a photo labeled Senior from 1966 with the message, "Come home bees, we love you." Frankie decides to take the photograph, intending to return it to his family. Later at the park with Bob, she reflects on her weariness from witnessing so much death. As she sips on a drink, Bob shares a letter from her mother describing how her brother will return from the war with anger issues and has joined the Black Panthers. Meanwhile, Coyote Lieutenant Melvin Turner invites Barb and Frankie to a farewell party at a club in Seine with transport arranged via AC-7. They decide to spend the day in Seine, enjoying lunch at a French-style bistro and marveling at how different it is from the Varo regions they've been stationed in. At the club that evening, Coyote introduces Frankie to his commanding officer, referred to as Riot. To Frankie's surprise, she recognizes him as R.Y. Walsh, Finlay's friend, who immediately remembers her. He greets her briefly before walking away. Chapter 13. Coyote informs Frankie that R.Y. Walsh is known as tough as nails and is not much of a talker. There are rumors that he's engaged to an admiral's daughter. Coyote expresses interest in Frankie, but she deflects his advances, preoccupied with ensuring Bob, who is quite drunk, gets safely back to their hotel. They return to the Caravelle Hotel where Bob goes to sleep, but Frankie is awakened by a phone call informing her that someone is waiting to see her. Assuming it's Coyote, Frankie is surprised to find Rai waiting for her at the rooftop bar. Rai invites her to dance, but she brings up his rumored fiancé. He apologizes and leaves. The next morning, Frankie confides in Bob about RY and her past crush on him. In December, Frankie tends to Private Albert Brown, a young black man with a buttock wound. He asks for a photo with her afterward, and she obliges. Shortly after, a helicopter arrives with another wounded man. A new nurse, Charlene, has just arrived and is visibly moved to tears by the scene. Frankie comforts her and takes charge of the situation. On Frankie's birthday, a small celebration is held at the park. Both Slim and Cote attend despite Coyote's persistent advances. Frankie continues to rebuff him He warns her that his time there is limited and suggests she not miss her chance with him. Chapter 14. On Christmas Eve, Frankie discusses with Bob how the American government distorts the truth in its reports while the news claimed no American casualties. The previous day, they know 7 people died in '01 alone. A helicopter arrives, piloted by Coyote and RY, who invite the women for a ride to chop down a Christmas tree. They all return and set it up in Barb and Frankie's hooch, decorating it together. When Barb and Coyote go to get drinks, Frankie and RY find themselves alone. RY expresses his interest in Frankie once more, but she reiterates her hesitation due to his engagement on Christmas Day. Despite the ceasefire, everyone enjoys a genuine holiday meal. They also organize a smaller farewell gathering for Bob at the park now that her tour of duty is complete. The next morning, Frankie discovers Bob has departed, leaving behind a note and a Polaroid of the 3 women together. Chapter 15. Shortly after, Frankie receives a letter from Bob describing her boredom at the new hospital stateside and the unwelcoming atmosphere for veterans. Returning home in January 1968, Frankie gets her Darrow's date eligible for return from overseas, marking the end of her tour on 15th March. On the 31st of the month, a rocket strikes the 71st evac area. Frankie's new roommate Margie Sloan panics, but Frankie quickly escorts them both to the hospital. Captain Moore, the new doctor, initially hesitates but swiftly takes charge as casualties flood in. The attack is relentless, overwhelming the hospital with wounded. RY arrives after hearing about the attack to check on Frankie's well-being amidst the chaos. Frankie encounters Private Albert Brown, severely wounded with 3 missing limbs. She stays by his side as he passes away, promising to write to his mother, Shirley. Returning to her hut later, Frankie finds the door shattered on the floor. The 31st January attack is later dubbed the Tate Offensive in American media. The widespread carnage prompts public skepticism about the war's narrative of success. Despite President LBJ's claim of only 249 American casualties, Frankie knows the reality of what she witnessed approaching her Darrows. Frankie worries about the lack of experienced nurses remaining despite occasional hatred for the war. She reaffirms her love for nursing. In February, she writes to her parents and Ethel expressing her decision to extend her stay in Vietnam, while her parents strongly oppose it. Eel, now in veterinary school, understands her choice. In March, Frankie learns she must take her R&R time before her next tour. She's directed to a beachside hotel in CWI for a well-deserved break. Chapter 16. Relaxing on the idyllic beach of the Coco Palms Hotel, Frankie is surprised to find RY there too. He reveals that he was the one who informed the officers about her overdue R&R. RY also shares that he has ended his engagement. Intrigued, Frankie agrees to have dinner with him that evening, then calls Bob for advice on their burgeoning relationship that night over cocktails. RY admits he had been interested in Frankie earlier, but assumed they had little in common. Him, a kid from Compton, and her from a different world. They are interrupted by Captain Edgar, to an older Army officer who expresses gratitude for their service. Afterward, RY surprises Frankie with a picnic dinner at a secluded spot. They share kisses and Their attraction intensifies, leading them to make love both aware they will return to Vietnam in 6 days they spend the following week together, cherishing each moment with their last day spent cocooned in bed. RY broaches the topic of Frankie leaving soon, but she interrupts, revealing she has decided to extend her commitment in Vietnam. RY, alarmed by the escalating war and his feelings for Frankie, initially opposes, but eventually decides to re-up, as well determined to stay with her. Chapter 17. Back at the 71st, Frankie receives a letter from Bob informing her tragically that Bob's brother Will was killed in a police shootout with the Black Panthers, despite surrendering. Meanwhile, in April, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. shakes the nation, followed by Robert Kennedy's assassination in June. On July 4, 1968, 3 escaped prisoners of war arrive at the hospital carrying their injured comrade Fred, who succumbs to a chest wound shortly after arrival. Shortly thereafter, a group of Vietnamese villagers arrives, victims of a napalm attack. Frankie notes the increasing use of napalm, a devastating weapon employed by the U.S. military. Distraught by the influx of injuries, Frankie disregards regulations to use the MAS system to call RY. That night she confides in him about her distress over the attacks. Later, RY clandestinely enters her room and comforts her. In November, Frankie is unexpectedly summoned to an emergency gang, only to discover it's a celebration announcing her promotion to First Lieutenant. RY is present, and amidst the joyous atmosphere they exchange heartfelt declarations of love. Chapter 18. On 14th March 1969, Frankie prepares to leave Vietnam. She leaves a goodbye note for Margie and is joined by RY, who will complete his own tour in 27 days. Back in California, Frankie arrives at the airport in her uniform, only to face hostility from protesters. Taxis refuse to pick her up, so she boards a bus alone, struggling with her bags as no one offers to assist her. Arriving home, Frankie's father greets her with surprise and a reserved demeanor. She presents him with a photo of her Bob and Eel for their hero's wall, but he remains distant. Her mother, however, warmly welcomes her and explains that her father has been struggling since Finlay's death. Chapter 19. After some rest, Frankie's mother begins orchestrating a return to normal life for Frankie. During lunch at the country club, a loud crash startles Frankie, prompting her to instinctively dive under the table. Much to her mother's embarrassment, Dr. Brainer, a family friend, reveals that Frankie's father had told everyone she had been studying abroad in Florence during her time away. Nightmares continue to haunt Frankie, and her parents criticize her smoking habit and newfound rough language, refusing to engage with her war experiences. Frankie reflects on the hypocrisy, noting how society glorifies sons at war but dismisses the contributions of women like nurses. The household atmosphere remains tense, prompting Frankie to call Barb and plan a homecoming party for Ryan Compton, visiting RY's parents at Stanley and Mo's Auto Repair. Frankie learns the devastating news from Stan that RY was killed in action just 3 days earlier, shot down. Distraught, Frankie returns home and confides in her mother about losing the man she loved, finding solace in her mother's comfort. Chapter 20. Frankie continues to struggle, spending many days unable to leave her Bed eventually Ethel and Bob visit her, urging her to find new reasons to keep going. Ethel shares her own journey in vet school and reconnecting with her high school boyfriend Noah Ellsworth. Barb expresses interest in joining an organization called Vietnam Veterans Against the War despite her turmoil. Frankie realizes she still loves being a nurse. The trio spends several days together, and when they part ways, Frankie decides to apply for a nursing position at a nearby small hospital. She is assigned to the night shift as a probationary nurse under Mrs. Henderson's supervision. In her new role, Frankie anticipates feeling frustrated with the menial tasks but resolves to work her way up. After a few weeks, Jose Garcia seeks her help for his wife Elena, a patient at the hospital. Despite protocol, Frankie decides to assist them herself. Chapter 21. By June, Frankie has been home for 3 months. The morning's headline reports the death of a nurse, First Lieutenant Sharon Lane, killed by enemy fire in Vietnam. Though Frankie didn't know Sharon personally, the news deeply affects her. Meanwhile, Frankie's mother arranges for her to visit an old schoolmate, Becky Gillen. Later that day, Frankie arrives at Becky's house to find herself surrounded by debutantes, sorority girls, and affluent men attending a wedding shower. Feeling out of place, Frankie unintentionally causes a scene when Becky Misundar understands her comments about her service in Vietnam that night. At the hospital, Frankie faces a critical situation when a patient with a gunshot wound arrives. Despite calling for a doctor and receiving no response, Frankie takes decisive action and performs a tracheotomy to save the young man's life. Proud of her quick thinking and skills, Frankie finds herself fired later on for being seen as a liability to the hospital. Chapter 22. Frankie returns home from the hospital, her uniform stained with blood from the emergency tracheotomy she performed initially concerned her. Parents quickly shift the conversation to the incident at Becky's where misunderstandings escalate into an argument. Frankie confronts her father about lying to others that she was in Florence instead of Vietnam and about his inability to acknowledge her service. With pride, frustrated, and feeling misunderstood, Frankie storms out of the house, grabbing Finlay's photo from their hero's wall before leaving. However, in her distressed state, she gets into a car accident, uncertain of where to turn, and realizing she needs help, Frankie decides to seek assistance at the Veterans Administration outpatient clinic. She waits outside until they open, hoping to speak with someone about her struggles since returning from Vietnam. When she finally meets with a doctor, he dismisses her concerns, asking insensitive questions and refusing to recognize her as a veteran because she wasn't in combat. Feeling more desperate than ever, Frankie calls Barb for support. Soon after, Barb and Ethel fly into town to be by her side. Ethel, whose father has a farmhouse, suggests Frankie move in there temporarily to gather herself and figure out her next steps in life. Part 2. Chapter 23. Virginia, April 1971. Frankie, now 25 years old, has found solace and stability under the care and compassion of her friends. Together, they've transformed their bunk house into a cozy 2-bedroom cottage over the past 18 months, spending evenings by the fireplace. Bob, now a bartender, has become deeply involved in activism through organizations like Vietnam Veterans Against the War (VVAW) and the Equal Rights Amendment Ethel, in her third year of veterinary school, contemplates marriage with Noah. Meanwhile, Frankie has thrived as a surgical nurse specializing in trauma surgery. She finds peace riding horses on the farm, a practice that suits her. After her shift, one day Frankie visits Barb at the tavern where she works. Barb urges Frankie to join VVAW for a major protest in Washington against the war. Despite Frankie's desire to move on from the war, she agrees to participate in this protest, feeling compelled to speak out against the atrocities and casualties she witnessed in Washington. Frankie and Bob navigate through a crowd of male veterans encountering skepticism about their status as veterans. Themselves undeterred, they march alongside others who oppose the war. The protest gains attention when Gold Star mothers are denied entry as they attempt to place wreaths on their sons' coffins, a moment captured by the media during the protest. Decorated soldiers dramatically discard their medals on the steps of the Capitol, a powerful symbol of dissent. Frankie experiences tear gas firsthand and encounters a young man affiliated with the League of Mia Families, selling bracelets to support prisoners of war. Amidst the chaos, Frankie meets Henry Adio, a 38-year-old psychiatrist from Southern California, who shares her passion for protesting the war. He mentions his work with war veterans, which resonates deeply with Frankie. Afterwards, Frankie reunites with Barb and admits that despite the challenges and emotional turmoil of the protest, she's glad she participated, feeling a renewed sense of purpose in her advocacy against the war. Chapter 24. Frankie asks Bob to accompany her to a fundraiser organized by Navy wives to support efforts to bring PS home at the luncheon, and Jenkins delivers a poignant speech about the challenges faced by families of PS, often left without closure as their loved ones are declared missing or killed in action. The group appeals for volunteers to help with letter writing campaigns and media outreach to raise awareness. After the speech, Frankie approaches and to discuss getting involved during their conversation and mentions knowing Frankie's mother Beth and offers condolences upon hearing about Beth's recent stroke and hospitalization. Filled with concern, Frankie rushes home and heads straight to the hospital ICU to visit her mother. She finds her father by Beth's bedside, their concern for her mother uniting them in a rare moment of shared vulnerability. Days later, Beth is discharged from the hospital and Frankie notices a change in her father's demeanor. He opens up about struggling with grief since Finlay's death and admits to tensions with Beth, who had accused him of mistreating Frankie. He reveals plans they had made for Frankie, a cottage near their home that Beth had insisted they renovate for Frankie's return. Her father also offers Frankie a set of car keys, a gesture symbolizing trust and independence. Chapter 25. Frankie settles into life at the cottage, finding purpose in her involvement with the League of Families. In San Diego, she throws herself into their letter-writing campaigns, contacting politicians and newspapers to advocate for the return of PS. In late June 1971, Frankie joins a fundraising effort at a local shopping center, selling bracelets and distributing flyers to raise awareness. She meets Joan, whose husband is in Honolulu, and they bond over their shared mission. It's at this event that Frankie unexpectedly encounters Henry. ASO once more accompanied by his nephew. Aruro expresses his intention to attend the Naval Academy, prompting a spirited discussion between Henry and Aruro about the military and its impact. Despite their differing views, Henry supports Frankie's cause with a generous donation before they depart in July. Ethel shares exciting news with Frankie. She and Noah have eloped. Ethel's letter brings a mix of joy and nostalgia, reminding Frankie of the enduring bonds forged during their challenging times in Vietnam. Chapter 26. Amidst the ongoing war and the tumultuous political climate, Frankie navigates through personal and societal challenges. In July 1972, Bette hosts a 4th of July party where Frankie feels a surge of anger during her father's toast honoring all the men who serve. Henry Au's unexpected presence at the party offers a distraction when Frankie reacts to the sound of a firecracker by instinctively hitting the ground. Henry supports her and walks her home where they share a vulnerable moment. Frankie admits to Henry that her heart still belongs to someone else, yet they end up sleeping together throughout the summer. Frankie continues to see Henry. Their relationship evolves amidst the backdrop of their shared activism and involvement in protests. In August, at Barb's urging, they attend a Vietnam Veterans Against the War (VVAW) march. During the Republican National Convention, the protest gains national attention when 3 veterans in wheelchairs disrupt Nixon's speech, dominating the media coverage the following day. As Frankie grapples with her complex emotions and commitments, the turbulent events of the era continue to shape her path forward. Chapter 27. In December, Frankie's life takes a significant turn after feeling unwell. She visits the doctor and learns that, despite being on birth control, she's 2 months pregnant. This news comes as a surprise and raises questions about her future plans. Just days later, during her shift at work, Frankie assists in an operation on a Vietnam veteran suffering from gastric cancer at the young age of 30. The situation strikes her as unusual, given the veteran age and health condition, prompting her to reflect on the enduring impacts of the war on those who served. That evening, at her birthday celebration, Frankie confides in Henry about her pregnancy. Henry responds by proposing marriage, urging her to say yes. Initially hesitant, Frankie eventually agrees, moved by Henry's commitment and support. Henry takes the traditional step of seeking her father's blessing, which he grants, signaling a new chapter in Frankie's life. As Frankie navigates these changes, she contemplates how her pregnancy and impending marriage will shape her future amidst the backdrop of ongoing personal and societal challenges. Chapter 28. In February, as Frankie prepares for her wedding to Henry and the imminent arrival of their baby, the news of Nixon signing the peace accord and the end of the Vietnam War brings a mix of emotions. Amidst this backdrop, Frankie learns that the first wave of PS are due to return home, and she watches anxiously as the news covers their arrival in Manila. To her surprise and shock, Frankie spots Rai among the returning PS, stepping out of the plane with a noticeable limp. Overwhelmed with emotions and the need to see him before her wedding, Frankie decides to greet him along with Bob and Ethel in San Diego at Air Station Myanmar, without informing Henry. When Frankie calls out to RY, she witnesses him being warmly embraced by a tall curvy woman, and a young girl who appears to be his daughter. This revelation stuns Frankie, realizing that RY had been married all along. The encounter leaves her grappling with conflicting feelings as she navigates this unexpected turn of events. On the eve of her own wedding. Chapter 29. Frankie's emotional turmoil reaches a breaking point as she faces the devastation of her miscarriage and the betrayal of RY's undisclosed marriage. In her vulnerable state, she makes the difficult decision that she cannot go through with marrying Henry. She confides in Bob and Eel, informing them that the wedding is off and asking them to return home. When Henry visits Frankie at the hospital, she bravely confronts the truth, revealing to him about RY's return as a P and her lingering feelings for him. This revelation marks a turning point as Frankie grapples with her emotions and the complexities of her relationships amid the aftermath of these painful events. Chapter 30. For a time, Frankie is inconsolable, working extra shifts to distract herself. She begins relying on various pills, some for sleep, others to stay awake for work. One day in a hedge, she encounters a gunshot victim at work, but is asked to leave the O due to her state. The following day, Frankie visits the beach and unexpectedly sees Ry with his family, his wife Melissa and their daughter Joey. Despite knowing better, she ends up following them home. Peering at them entering their house, she quickly drives away. Upon RY noticing her that night, Frankie accidentally misses her shift at work. Soon after, Frankie is summoned to the director of nursing's office, where Mrs. Stone expresses concern about her recent behavior. Mrs. Stone suggests Frankie should have taken more time off after her miscarriage. Despite Frankie's objections, she is placed on leave. Later, Bob calls Frankie and shares that she's met someone new, an ARCU lawyer named Jeremiah Jerry M. As they talk, the doorbell interrupts them, revealing RY standing at Frankie's doorstep. He confesses that he married Missy 2 months before his deployment, partly out of a desire for someone to wait for him and partly because she was pregnant. Initially intending to divorce upon his return, RY found solace in Missy's letters, which became his lifeline. RY tells Frankie he will leave Miss if she wants to be with him. They share a kiss and move into the bedroom together. Chapter 31. During that summer, Frankie and RY continue their relationship, though RY has yet to leave his wife. He assures Frankie that is consulting with a lawyer and trying to resolve things, but is concerned about losing custody of his daughter. Meanwhile, Frankie grows weary of hiding their affair and lying about being on leave, all while struggling with increased pill use. In August, Frankie and Ethel attend Bob's wedding. As they discuss love, honor, and commitment, Frankie resolves to end things with Ry when she confronts him. Next, expressing her inability to continue, he surprises her by proposing on one knee, and she reluctantly agrees. Come November, Frankie meets with Mrs. Stone to discuss her readiness to return to work. A week later, expecting to meet RY at a wedding dress shop, Frankie is stood up. Instead of waiting, she heads to her shift. By the end of the day, news spreads that Melissa Walsh is in the hospital, having just given birth. Frankie unexpectedly encounters RY at the hospital but flees in distress, taking 2 Valium pills and seeking solace in a nearby bar. After a few drinks, she drunkenly leaves and ends up crashing her car into a bicyclist. Chapter 32. Frankie wakes up in the hospital, relieved to hear that the bicyclist Bill Brightman is recovering well. However, she is charged with a DUI. Recognizing she needs help, Frankie decides to seek support at the New Center, hoping to attend group therapy. Unfortunately, she's turned away because the sessions are only for combat veterans. Feeling lost, Frankie reaches out to Bill Brightman to apologize for the accident. Later at home, she resorts to taking more pills. When Frankie wakes up again, she finds herself in an ambulance after overdosing on pills. Her actions are interpreted by her father as a suicide attempt, leading to her being placed on a mandatory psychiatric hold in a hospital ward. Chapter 33. When Frankie's mind clears, she meets with Henry, the director of the psychiatric ward. He assures her that she'll be assigned a new therapist, but informs her that her mother has arranged for an 8-week stay at the treatment facility to begin due to her pill overdose. Frankie faces the prospect of temporarily losing her nursing license. Henry also shares that he is now engaged to someone named Natalie. During their conversation, Henry suggests that Frankie may have post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from her time in Vietnam. Frankie insists she didn't experience combat like PS, who were tortured. However, Henry emphasizes that trauma isn't a competition and highlights the dangers she faced in her role. He also points out the disparity in how different veterans, like PS versus others, were treated upon returning home. Henry introduces Frankie to Dr. Alden, who becomes her therapist. Over the next week, she pours out her emotions to him. When Bob visits, Frankie opens up about the truth of her tumultuous relationship with RY. Chapter 34. By February of 1974, the world had shifted away from the war, and Vietnam veterans blended into the scenery, existing unseen among a public that either disdained them or simply ignored their presence. Henry and Dr. Alden both agree that Frankie has made significant progress during her time at the treatment center. She has confronted her internal struggles, particularly her complex emotions towards RY and her experiences in Vietnam. Her parents arrived to take her home by the summer of 1974. Frankie has regained her driver's license, though her nursing license remains suspended. She informs her parents of her decision to move, intending to sell the cottage they had given her in order to fund a fresh start. While her parents express concern, they ultimately support her decision. After finalizing the sale in August, Frankie embarks on a road trip with Bob to explore potential new beginnings in Milla, Montana. They come across a worn-out farmhouse with a for sale sign that captures Frankie's attention. Its remote and serene location appeals to her as a place where she can truly find peace. Chapter 35. In September 1982, Frankie receives an invitation to a reunion for the 36th evac hospital, coinciding with the unveiling of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., scheduled for November, reflecting on the mistreatment of Vietnam veterans and the revelation in the late 70s about Agent Orange's cancer-causing effects. Frankie recalls Donna, a fellow nurse who sought her help years ago and has since become a close friend and colleague at the local hospital. Together they transformed their farmhouse into a ranch named the Last best place a sanctuary for women who served in Vietnam adorned with a hero's wall displaying photographs of these courageous women. Frankie travels to Washington for the reunion on 13th November, meeting up with Bob and Ethel to attend the memorial unveiling. Her parents also attend, hoping to honor Finlay's memory engraved on the memorial. Her father opens up about his regret over how he treated Frankie upon her return from the war. While searching for Jammy's name, Frankie is astonished to encounter him alive and well. Jam reveals he kept the stone Frankie gave him, which encouraged him to persevere through tough times. He shares that he is now divorced. The book concludes with Frankie contemplating the significance of remembrance and the importance of acknowledging the women who served. She silently affirms, "We were there